All right, good time of day, everybody. I'm super excited to have our next CIO speaker series. I want to introduce Mark Settle, who is a seven-time CIO, and most recently, he is an author of Truth from the Valley, a practical primer on IT management for the next decade. And we're excited to have you here because we've chosen that book as our first book club book. And we've talked about it a little bit, but before we get into that, I did want to just let everyone know that I found out an interesting fun fact about Mark. And that is that as a youth, he was next to an actively erupting volcano. And I know he has a PhD, and I'm probably not going to say it right, but geology or something to this effect. Mark, can you give us a little insight on you being next to a volcano and how you translated that PhD into becoming a CIO?
I wasn't expecting this as our first question, but when I went off to school, I'd always been interested in science, and I really didn't go off wanting to do any one particular thing. So I had to declare a major at the end of my freshman year, and I went through the course catalog and I just X'd any course that looked potentially interesting to me. And because we never had an earth science course in my high school, a lot of the geology stuff looked interesting. And the other appeal was, I thought, if I get a job in geology, I can probably wear blue jeans like for the rest of my life. So what's wrong with that picture? And so, yeah, I kind of wandered in and got seduced by the whole thing. And there was a professor who had research funds to go study actively erupting volcanoes. So I've actually been to like a half a dozen actively erupting volcanoes.
Now, was this to do science work or some sort of study for your PhD?
Okay, so you've opened the door, so be careful what you ask for now. So he was funded by NASA at the time, and we were trying to model what different volcanoes would look like on the surface of Mars and Venus and other planets under different gravitational and atmospheric conditions. So what we did was we went to the actively erupting volcanoes, tried to capture, construct a model of their eruption mechanics, and then repeat that with, again, different gravity, atmospheric conditions, and predict what the thing would look like. So
that is awesome. You've just demonstrated that anyone can be a CIO, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Probably true. That's probably true.
All right, so we're all very excited. Most of the whole group has read your book. I think it's just a great book, and it really resonated with me as my career has gone over a few decades, and just the change in IT. And of course, many people think that Silicon Valley and our field tends to be, as dynamic as the companies that are around us all the time. So I'm wondering, what was it that sort of inspired you to write the book? I know you've written another book prior to this, but was there something that occurred, and what were you hoping to get out of it?
So, I've worked for lots of companies. Most of them were much larger than the average company that you see here in the Bay Area. And I've had a home in the Bay Area since '99. And so I had, kind of looked over the fence and seen a little bit into how companies here operated. I'm specifically speaking to like the startup companies, right? The high-tech startup companies here in the Valley. And I was very intrigued. And then I worked for Okta, as many people know, for 3 years. Both pre and post IPO. And so I kind of got firsthand experience in just how unique things were when you had no data centers, everything was SaaS, security concerns, were sort of table stakes to be able to sell to customers. You had a millennial workforce, you had to compete in the market for talent, and although some features of our operating model, if you will, our IT operating model here in the Valley, obviously appear in other parts of the country, nowhere do they appear collectively, in the same totality. Nowhere, I think, and I'm not being arrogant, it's just there's something unique about the way IT gets practiced here in the startup community. And again, if you've never worked in one of those larger, more conventional kind of organizations, the gulf between their operations and the way we do things typically here, you really can't appreciate. And in fact, I can underscore that with a couple of examples. I was talking to a CIO at an East Coast company based out of Boston. It's a women's retail apparel company. and they were just starting to experiment with agile practices for application support. And they had like one application team that was prototyping agile as a way that they might, go about their business in the future. That was one example. And then another was a CIO at a fairly large industrial concern in Connecticut. And she was recruited to her CIO job in January of this year. And she came from an organization that made pretty extensive use of AWS. A lot of production systems were on the AWS platform. And when she joined her new company, she inquired about how they were leveraging the cloud, and people brought in, how should I put this, information to her, which they were quite proud of, like little sort of prototyping, experimental, put your toe in the water kind of things. She said, I realized like they thought they knew what they were doing, but they just hadn't taken it to a scale or a level of complexity where they were seeing real business benefits. It was effectively a hobby project that was being pursued in the IT organization. So I just use both of those to underscore the point that the difference between the way we operate here and what you'd find in a lot of companies in St. Louis and Detroit and Hartford, Connecticut, and elsewhere is very, very different. And so, I thought I could actually perform a public service by writing the book and kind of laying out this landscape of the way we do things here, and not so much in preaching to people and say, you've got to deal with all this stuff, like, get ready. But to people that aren't in the bubble, the Valley bubble, they should use the book as kind of a strategic planning guide and kind of look at these emerging trends and say, what do I need to double down on in terms of developing an organizational competency for my business, for my company in the future? We can't be good at everything. We can't be good at automation and security and app support and cloud ops and blah, blah, blah. But there are a handful of things here that in this budgeting cycle in particular, we should start making some investments in terms of expertise and technology and process. So that was really the goal of the book.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting to think about the fact that this new world order of COVID has really sort of accelerated this all remote workforce. And I think there's going to be a lot of companies that are going to embrace this. And I never really thought about this before until just this second, but these companies are going to be extending in our world, IT management, business technology across the globe. And so I think there's going to be this acceleration. You talk about agile as an example you gave me there. I think you're going to see these companies embrace things like this with this sort of forcing function of, democratization of doesn't really matter where you work anymore. I love that idea. And sometimes I do wonder, like when I read the book, I was like, I'm in the bubble and I wonder how other people view looking, back at us sometimes. But I think that it's a really good primer for the way we should all be thinking about the next generation of how we operate as a IT function. So I love that. And so mission accomplished, at least for one person here. So thank you for that.
Excellent.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, one of the things that's happened over the last couple decades, at least in my world, is, the consumerization of technology. It used to be in the IT function, and I'm speaking generically here, that you would have a real competitive advantage potentially in the technology that you actually purchased. The technology stacks have all been pretty much, even across the board at this point. So one of the things that I think about is now it's around consultative and actually getting these pieces of technology to operate a little more efficiently. But because the simplicity of the technology stacks, lots of times things become very decentralized. So I was hoping you could give us your thoughts a little bit around how you view today's world from sort of a decentralized technology ownership point of view, and how you still provide a lot of service to the organization as a whole around solutioning. Could you kind of just touch on that? Maybe you've evolved over the years.
So I come from a command and control, history where IT bought everything. Like nobody could go and buy a monitor, or there wasn't even a consumer app to speak of. So in the current world that we're in, obviously you've got functional departments that go out sometimes with little or no IT involvement, and they bring in new forms of technology. And I think a lot of IT leaders and their organizations have struggled, to cope with that new kind of operating model. And we've labeled those initiatives as shadow IT, which is kind of, funny because in a way we were the technology evangelists for a long time, saying our companies would be so much better off if we just made greater and broader use of information technology. And then they went off and did it. And then we said, no, what do we mean like that? We meant with us in control, like everything comes, through us. We don't want you going out there and doing things without our direct involvement. So you've got to get out of that command and control mentality. And I promoted this idea of stewardship. So it might be, deliciously satisfying to actually kind of thumb your nose at the functional groups and say, well, you bought it, you didn't ask me, you're on your own. Like, don't come to me with your problems. But that would probably be not only short-sighted, but career limiting as well. And I think the stewardship role that IT should play is to, try to understand what's out there, develop an inventory, apply some vendor management principles to renewals so that you're helping the company make the best use of its financial investment in the portfolio. Make sure security precautions and data handling, measures are put in place to keep those folks out of trouble. I always kid that, people in some of these functions like marketing, I'll just pick out, they couldn't spell GDPR, if you ask them to. And then there's ways to increase the value as well. So you could bring in a tool like WalkMe that would help enable, deeper use of some of the tools that are already there, which is a way of getting more kind of value realization out of the tools that you have. So that's my take on this, which is in the new role that you can't necessarily control. There's ways you can add value. Another that I failed to mention is, if you have some kind of an API integration platform, you can help in using APIs on these different platforms and tools to make the corporation more efficient in ways that an individual functional group wouldn't think about. Like, HR is going to worry about integrating the tools that HR bought and whether that information would be useful upstream or downstream in finance or some other organization. They'd leave that to somebody else to sort out. So I think IT can add a lot of value there as well.
Yeah, I really like that. I've also sort of experienced the old days, working in the manufacturing sector where, total control and coming to the realization that that's not the best thing for the company. The company will actually be a lot more successful if you can have everyone participate in that technology side and getting more value out of it. So I'm excited about continuing to impress upon us as a industry, as our running IT operations across whatever vertical you're in. I think it's going to be that is the radical change, and accepting that is going to be what sets you apart, and that will be the new strategic driver for a company from our point of view.
I still think it's important to bring in the systems of record and under one centralized function. And we have colleagues that will go unnamed in this call where finance owns the NetSuite system, HR owns the Workday system. There's other sales ops is in charge of Salesforce and trying to orchestrate some degree of coordination and controls, compliance, et cetera, data management, mastering principles across that kind of a organization can be very, very difficult. So companies need to get educated that there's some real synergies and really some almost like mandatory, management principles that need to be enforced across the major systems of record.
Agreed. There's your tier one apps that, especially as you're a company that's going to mature and become, potentially a public company, as an example. Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to pick your brain around, and then we're going to open it for regular Q&A, and the document is getting filled out, which is great. So it is a new world and an ever evolving sort of a group of skills that you're going to need at a high level. And this is a really rich and deep kind of question here, so you could go on for a long time. But from a career development point of view, what's the advice you would give young, high potential individuals over the next decade? Like, what should they focus in on and at a high level to be an IT professional?
So I've talked about this a little bit in the past. So I would counsel everybody, when you take the break over the holidays at the end of the year, in most organizations, sometime in the next several months, the company's going to perform its annual performance review on you. It'll be administered surgically, to you. But while you have some time to reflect and you're out of sort of the day-to-day stuff in the last couple of weeks of the year, you should evaluate the company's performance in terms of your career development. And I think there's sort of three axes for doing that. So one obviously is technical. Did your experience over the last year expand, either broaden or deepen technical skills in some fashion or another? The second area is really around the business knowledge that you've gained. And people are not always terribly aware of that, but as you progress in your career, your ability to keep up with all the technical changes that are happening gets tougher and tougher and tougher typically. And the business knowledge that you've acquired actually becomes a big part of the equity that you bring to the job market, why people are going to want to hire you. And then the third dimension is, your experience in leading, managing, coordinating, inspiring teams of people. And it doesn't mean you have to have a management job with like 10 direct reports, but you could have managed an international project team, or you could have had a cross-functional team given geographic location. You could have been put on a project where half of the people were contractors and you had to kind of juggle, full-time FTE colleagues and the activities of the contractors. And so, when you look back over that 12-month period, and if you feel like, my experience in 12 months didn't really move the needle. And I've used this term intellectual strip mining. The company mined my brain and my energy to get what it wanted, but I'm not seeing a whole lot in return. So I'm not suggesting you do anything draconian at that point, but you should be more mindful and maybe more proactive in that following 12-month period. I would remind people that development only happens when you take a risk. And so it's not the company's fault if you're sort of sitting there dumb and happy doing the same thing over and over and over again. It's kind of unfair to the company to say at the end of the 12-month period, gee, this place isn't doing anything for my career because you've never really stepped up and challenged yourself during the course of the year. And many times your management will think you don't want to be challenged, like you like what you're doing. You've never really shown much interest in that area. And I guess my last bit of advice, so I think that annual kind of assessment can be very beneficial. And the last, and I think Brian, you and I talked about this, you should always ask for feedback from, especially like business partners. And I mean, your manager is supposed to give you feedback, but when you finish a project or even do something with like a peer, any advice you can get about how to do something better. What I always find, I'm going to say like 98 times out of 100, especially with business partners involved in IT activities, if you open the door, they immediately have an observation to share with you. But they're not going to just offer it up there out of the blue because why would they do that? Maybe it's semi-critical, or it's it could be interpreted as an inadequacy or a failure or gap or a shortcoming in what you had actually done. So most people are not going to just sort of say, oh, by the way, I thought you might like this bit of feedback. But if you open the door, you can learn a lot. And even if there isn't feedback, I can guarantee you people will respect you because you asked the question.
Yeah, that's great. I like the idea of doing a evaluation of the company as opposed, flipping the script a little bit. I think that's a really good idea. I did want to just go ahead.
One thing I would caution is this request for feedback, suggestion, that doesn't apply to your home life with your spouse, because you'll probably get all the feedback that you want. You don't really need to invite a lot more.
Right. If you ever want the truth, ask the significant other. You'll find out the truth. I did have one follow-up question to one of the key points you made there around, the business knowledge being, the value you bring. Can you maybe make that a little more salient of for you, what is the business knowledge? Or is there a specific thing you're thinking of when you go in? And I know you're interviewing for the next role in your life, how do you articulate that? And what are some things to focus in on?
So, I just look back at my own career. I worked for Visa. I learned a ton about how banks operate, how the overnight bank settlement process operates, how credit cards work and authorization, et cetera. And I worked for Earl Electronics, which was a big, a distributor of electronic components. So I learned a lot about supply chains and international supply chains, et cetera. And, that's just two examples that enabled me to, like in future interviews, let's say, I think I was able to ask some more perceptive and penetrating questions about the business and where some of the issues were in the business, and really take that kind of interview conversation beyond just sort of IT considerations. And in fact, there's another anecdotal story that I'll share with you. There was one job that I actually landed. So I walked in and I got to know the SVP that hired me pretty well. And I said, why did you hire me for this job? Because now that I'm here and I understand what the job's about and I look at my background, I'm kind of at a loss as to why. And I know there were other candidates. And she said, you just ask better questions than anybody else. That's why we picked you.
I love that. And believe it or not, that's something I do too in an interview. When I get to the end of an interview and I say, hey, you have any questions for me? And if they haven't demonstrated any interest in the company at all, or they're curious, I am very put off by that. So I think that is a really good, valid point that everyone should take away. All right, so thank you for those 3 questions. I could talk to you all day, but of course, part of this is to open it up to everybody, especially since we all read the book. So we're gonna start the Q&A from everyone in the group here. Just a reminder that when you introduce yourself, please let Mark know your role. And also, because we're so dispersed around the world, just where you are at physically in the world. So we're gonna start it off. Parl, would you do us the honors?
Sure. Hi, Mark. My name is Parl. I'm a senior data analyst on the data team, and I'm from Detroit, but I'm currently in San Diego. There's some peacocks behind me, which is really cool. So I wanted to let everyone know. But I'm going to change my question from number 1 to number 9, because you kind of talked about the self-development and self-reflection a little bit. I did really like that section in general. The question was, oops. Thanks, Brian. So the portion where you talk about developing really talented people, I'm hoping to change it from I'm not a manager, but I'm reflecting on myself. But was there a moment in your life you knew that one of those were a major blocker for you? And how did you conquer it and grow from it?
That's a big question. I think I had to get over at a certain point, proving to everybody that, in my own humble opinion, I was the smartest guy in the room. And I think I did that sometimes. This is more like the confessions of a CIO, maybe, Brian, than a book club conversation. But I think, sometimes I did that for my own, edification, right? So I took some pleasure in asking questions that nobody even had thought of before, or and some of it wasn't so much maybe what I did, but maybe the way that I did it as well. So I think I kind of, you kind of learn over time that everybody's got to be kind of part of developing a plan or executing a project or designing something. You just don't walk in like you've come down from the mountain with the directions and stone tablets and like you tell people what to do. Along those lines, one of the stages in my career where I think that became particularly acute. I think when you're a first-time CIO, you really spend a lot of time. And Brian, you're not a first-time CIO, but you spend a lot of time proving to yourself and everybody around you that you know everything, right? You're really running the whole place. And what people learn over time is, your skills and bandwidth just don't scale to be able to do that. And that's why being able to build, productive teams becomes so important in your ability to work with other people as well. So, good.
Thanks.
Lise, you're next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Liz, and I'm a business systems analyst, and I am located in Quito, Ecuador. And my question is, how do you think the move to remote work will change the way companies attract and retain talent?
I'm not personally convinced that this is the the whole new world model. Now, a lot will depend on how long it persists. I've heard of studies that have been done where people who talk about wanting to come back to a work or kind of an office environment, typically younger people, are really attracted by the opportunity to socialize with other people. They miss the office because they have relationships there. Older people, predictably, with children and other activities that they're involved in, many times they miss the work collaboration part. The ability to go into a conference room and do stuff on a whiteboard and those kind of things. So I'm not so sure some of those instincts won't kick back in again, when everybody. It's interesting, I was on a call earlier this morning with somebody from Detroit, of all places, who had used the comparison to the 9/11 attack on the US and how catastrophic and disturbing it was, but the fact that really everybody jumped right back on airplanes and started flying again, right, when they could, like after they figured out what the problem was. And so, maybe the difference with this obviously is, distributing a vaccine worldwide is going to take a long time before you can confidently say I can walk out of a home or go to an office. But I think some of the attractions of the office are going to be there. Will it ever be completely the way it was? Hard to say. In certain industries, it probably will, actually. If you're a manufacturing-based company, your major part of your workforce is going to have to come in every day. You have to distribute product. People have to get in trucks and go to people's homes and those kind of things. So I don't know if it's going to be this revolutionary new world order that a lot of people prognosticate. Now, as far as attracting talent, I do suspect there'll be a lot more flexibility, in working hours and things of that nature. I think you almost have to do that to attract people. But even newly hired people, I think, will want to come in and learn more. My own daughter has gone to work for a company since the crisis started, and she said it's kind of ironic that even when they've had some small get-togethers, like they've gone to a park, like a small subset of people that she works with, they'll go to a park and they'll socially distance. But she said when they get together, they still tell the stories of things that happened in the old days. So in part, these events were staged to help her feel included in the group. She said it's actually almost had the opposite effect because they miss each other so much that when they get together, they just socialize about the things that they did before, and they kind of struggle to remember to include her. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think for a lot of people, the office environment, whether it's 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and whether the industry is construction or enterprise software, there'll be a lot of variations. I don't think there'll be one standard. That's long-winded, but
that's good. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. I think it's going to be a hybrid model, and it'll really depend on industry for sure. Yeah, I think if you're a tech company and you don't need that physical office, it's a lot easier. If you are in certain sciences, or construction, manufacturing, of course, those things you have to physically be there. No matter what, it will not be the same. That is for sure. We do know that it will be a difference, some sort of difference. And the grand experiment of having all these companies forced to do something has removed potentially the fear of back to the sort of control mechanism where I must control people being in the office. I only know they're productive if I see them. I think that whole thing is going away. So it'll be interesting. That'll be a topic for a year from now to figure out, how this is all shaking out. Daniel, you have the next question.
Yeah, hi Mark, I'm Daniel. I also live in Quito, Ecuador, and I'm a senior integrations engineer. My question is more of a interesting one from engineering. So in software engineering, we have a paradigm called convention over configuration. So that talks about using frameworks to reduce the number of decisions that any single developer would have to make when building their software. And I'm wondering if you think that also applies to an extent to IT, and whether there's any frameworks that you and your teams have used over the years that can help your team be more I guess, quick to market in your solutions and not have to make as many decisions on the day-to-day?
Well, so yeah, okay. So there's an influx of machine learning kind of technologies that are coming into certain parts of IT. Brian and I are both. Brian, are you using MoveWorks? Just out of curiosity.
At my last company, I used MoveWorks, not here.
So anyway, this is an example of a firm, and there are several competitors where they use machine learning as applied to tickets and issues and requests that you would send in typically to an IT service desk. And it's a tool that's trying to automate the responses to those kind of things, based on information that you supply, virtually by responding to questions from a chatbot of one type or another. So that eliminates, that reduces some of the latency potentially in responding to end user issues. I think actually this one example believes that they've deployed their tool at Symantec, and I think they deflected about 50% of the nominal incoming traffic to the service desk. So, and presumably the traffic that got deflected was handled to the satisfaction of the people that experienced the tool. So that's an example. The adoption, this is a stretch of a bit. So the adoption of agile practices and application support, business application support, and software engineering, I think has been beneficial, and it effectively leads to the continual curation of the priority queue of what comes in from the business, because you've got a 2-week cycle and you kind of got to juggle things around and figure out like what they really need. Some IT shops use a Kanban kind of a process to do that as well. And so when the business says, how come I can't get my stuff, or like, why does it take so long, or what happened to my request? IT can say, well, you know what, the head of sales ops comes in here every Monday and looks at the Kanban list and reprioritizes us on a weekly basis. So if you've got a problem with what's coming out the other end, go talk to him or her, because we're taking our orders from, and if we're not getting to stuff fast enough, let's you and me go to the CFO and get some more headcount into this support team, because that's the only way we're going to be able to generate more throughput. But that's kind of pretty revolutionary, because if you go back again to the old days, or the way businesses, I should say, the way businesses practice maybe in a lot of these companies, more conventional companies we talked about before, some of them pretty typically have quarterly release processes for major business applications, because the ERP systems are sort of the cornerstone of many of the business processes, and other applications have significant dependencies on the ERP system. So it's not at all uncommon, and the kind of life that I've led in the past, you would pick 1 week during the quarter. It might be the 7th or 8th or 9th week. It'd be after quarter close and before quarter end. You freeze systems for a couple of days, put in all the modifications for that 90-day period, make sure that nothing went wrong, and turn everything back on, and just wait for another 90 days to update things. And so I think that's reduced some of the latency in the world of IT as well. The third opportunity, so this is something I'm very interested in at the present time, are these new low-code coding platforms that are highly iconized. And IT groups, especially out here in the Valley, have gotten away from writing applications. I mean, we're pretty much assembling the jigsaw puzzle pieces of some kind of SaaS portfolio, and then we use an integration platform to tie it all together and hope for the best. But there's still an opportunity to build sort of lightweight apps that may skin part of that portfolio. So take, for example, you've got like a team of people that get in a truck every day in Calgary, and they go out and visit active pumping well sites. It's a maintenance team, and they need information about a lot of different things that exist in a lot of different systems. And guess what? There's no app they can go buy that does it the way that Chevron wants that job done. So you could use a low-code. So you could do two things. You could go write something in Java from scratch, right? A bespoke application. Or you could jump on one of these low-code platforms and actually come up with something that was optimized for the execution of a specific process or the activities of a certain team. Could be the field marketing team, maybe for field marketing events. You'd have your own GitHub field marketing application of the way that your CMO wants those to be conducted. So there might be a very interesting opportunity here to kind of get back into the app development business using these low-code platforms. stay tuned, Brian. I'm going to write about that in another couple of months.
Yeah, hopefully use GitLab as the example instead of GitHub for us. If you could, that would be great. It's interesting. We were talking earlier about how, all the tech stacks have been pretty well commoditized, and you're using an analogy of, jigsaw puzzle. It's tied together with application platforms, but it is interesting to think about the future of technology and some of the new problems that we're trying to solve. And I think AI, low code platforms, ML as an example. I think all of those things are, if you know the business you're in, and then you bring along the technologies that are more cutting edge and applying those technologies to the business solutions, and maybe get ahead of even what the business might be asking, be more of a dynamic shop. And now that we don't have the burden of operating all of these heavy, I'll pick on, a big heavy ERP system, you have more time to do those things. So I do think that those are cutting edge areas that we should all be embracing. Rob, you have a great question here coming up. Can you verbalize and also let Mark know where you're at?
Sure. Hey, Mark, Rob Parker. I run our data team. I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks for coming today. It's been a really great discussion so far. My question is from your book, Truth from the Valley. There's a section around people, part 1. You talk about interviewing people, and one of your break the script approaches, where you sort of take the interview off the beaten path. What's your favorite break the script interview question? I'm breaking the script.
You are breaking the script. Well, usually you know a little bit about the candidate, and you might know something about places they've worked, or I don't know if I don't really have a standard per se. Now, I will take, the standard break the script is like, tell me about your biggest failure, or tell me about some kind of problem that you had to overcome. People should always have kind of a prepared answer for that one. Another one is, what would other people say are your 3 strongest traits or qualities, or whatever. So I don't know if I have a standard break the script, but you want to definitely get the candidate off balance in some fashion or another. And if it's something about their personal background, that not only breaks the script sometimes, but it puts them at ease, and you can get a little farther. Another part of that interview, and I've done a lot of interviewing and on both sides of the table, is to just become a much better listener. You look at too many interviews where the interviewer is spending all this time delivering information about the company or the role they're interviewing for or the issues they're dealing with. And I remember this has stayed with me for years. There was a firm that was coaching us about how to interview, and they had video of like real life interviews, and they would show us interviews where the interviewer would speak literally for more than 45 minutes during the hour, and the interviewee only had a chance to speak for like 10 or 15 minutes. So whatever. But the listening part of it is something people don't really do too effectively. And contrast that with, if you don't jump in immediately and you allow the long pause, the candidate or prospect typically offers up information which they never, would have otherwise, because the burden's on them to fill the gap. So make them come up with, follow-on observation.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Christopher, you have the next one.
Mark, Christopher Nelson. I run enterprise applications here at GitLab. And so was very smitten with your concept of moving from plan, build, run to broker, integrate, orchestrate. And the question I have is, how do you know when your business partners are ready? Because I can see a scenario where we understand the concepts, we understand how we're now brokering more, the focus is on integration, et cetera. But how do we know when our business partners are ready to make that leap to that new terminology?
Well, usually they lead the charge, right? I mean, they don't use the terminology, but they're out there doing things that put you into a broker role, because you've got to come in and say to them, I know you've fallen in love with Greenhouse, but there's 4 other recruiting and applicant tools that have these other pros and cons. And so we'd like to slow the train down and help kind of broker a broader look at what's going on. Yeah, my experience is they tend to lead in that conversation, particularly out here. So I haven't found that to be.
Well, no, I think that's interesting because I think that, to your point, they lead in the action. I think it's then what I think I'm hearing now is if that's the action that's happening and they may be tied to some old verbiage, it's time to then we can introduce the new verbiage and say, hey, let's describe what's happening and here's how we see our role here.
Right. And maybe, you know, they're going to come at those issues strictly from a functionality point of view, right? That's how they're going to think about an application. And there's many other considerations like security and the ecosystem you're buying into, like what that particular tool plays with nicely and plays with not so nicely. And people can be very easy, well, we're all easily seduced by vendor pitches, let's face it. And they need some help and you know, be forced to look at alternatives. You know, in larger conventional companies, and I think this is still the practice, sometimes you're forced to, by the internal rules of the company, to have evaluated at least 3 vendors for a particular purchase, right? And you'd have to come in and say, you know, these were the pros and cons, and this is how we landed here. You don't just show up and say, oh, we fell in love with this thing, we want to go buy it. That's
right.
That's, again, a bigger company, that would be a pretty standard kind of operating practice. But no, I haven't seen the business, you know, pull back from that concept.
Okay. Thanks.
Alicia, you're next.
Hello, my name is Alicia. I am in beautiful, cloudy Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I run procurement here at GitLab. And you started to touch on it a little bit, kind of as you were talking with Christopher about, you know, looking at 3 different vendors and some of those different things. So that's really where my question is coming from. You talked in your book a little bit about shadow IT. And I started drawing a lot of parallels to shadow purchasing in the org, and where a lot of times businesses, they find a shiny product and they've decided they're going to buy it and it's already negotiated and all they need from procurement is to just stamp it. So my question is around, how have you seen procurement teams overcome some of the shadow purchasing that's happening in the org, and how would you describe some of the most value that procurement brings to the table that could lead to some of those conversations?
That's a good question. This is a whole hour conversation. I mean, one of the reasons people resist the procurement process is because it slows things down, right? And I would suspect, I'm going to share some of my small company experience here. You know, typically you don't staff up in depth in like the legal and procurement and security areas that you need to be able to process these new procurement requests. And so again, you know, after a couple of disappointing experiences, functions have a tendency to go off and solve their problems on their own by shortcutting, you know, those things. So I mean, one way to overcome that is to provide more bandwidth around those functions. And then the other thing I'm sure you're more than aware of, like the legal function will typically get tied up at end of quarter with big deals that are coming through. So they've got other things to worry about. And, you know, if somebody's sitting in marketing that wants to go buy a marketing database and needs a contract reviewed or whatever by legal, well, guess what? We're not going to do that. We got a deal here that's, you know, that's money coming in the door if we can get this deal paperwork finished up. So the bandwidth of the back office processes, you know, are probably the biggest deterrent that really turns people away. So solving that kind of problem. Prioritization can help a lot. And that can be difficult because people think everything, their own personal, you know, needs are the most important thing. I've seen procurement groups shoot themselves in the foot because they spend as much time on a $10,000 purchase as on a $100,000 purchase. Some people just love to crucify vendors. You know what? They are going to subject every contract, every price negotiation, everything to, like, you know, the gauntlet. And it's just nothing's coming through on my watch here, you know, until they've been fully punished and tortured, and so you can end up a lot of time, wasting time on smaller kind of things. So there should be a way to kind of fast track. And then I guess my last bit of advice, particularly in companies that have a big exposure to SaaS applications, once it comes in the door, it's like nobody owns this application. So the vendor will call up, I'm sure you've experienced this, the vendor will call up and say, we're going to turn this thing off, December 1st. And it comes in some part of the organization, and whoever receives it says, well, I'm not really responsible for this. Maybe I wasn't even here when they bought it. Like, I don't even know why I'm getting this thing. So nothing happens. The vendors finally says, well, next Monday it's off. Like, we're turning it off. Everybody goes into panic mode. Somebody runs around with a PO. The vendors jacked up the price by like 7 or 10%, probably more than the increases that you are getting in your own commercial product, right? And you're giving away these things because panic has set in and nobody wants this thing turned off, next Monday. And so if you can get your arms around the inventory of apps that are out there and anticipate the renewal dates, and do some pre-planning so you're not caught in the panic mode, which usually leads to fiscal irresponsibility, I think that can add a lot. And maybe, doing that on a more consistent basis gets people to respect the function a little bit more and involve you earlier in the new acquisitions as well, new purchases. So.
Thank you.
Love it. We have time for one more question. Justin, it's a great question. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time again today, Mark. I also really appreciated some of the things you shared, and I felt really honest over a year ago at the Volcano conference in San Francisco. But the question I have to ask here is, we're on the path to be a public company. That's a big transition. It's an important one. There's lots of considerations. And I'm curious, what are the most important signals or milestones to help us know, to be aware of for the IT organization to achieve this? Another way to phrase it might be also like, how do we know we're on the path or off the path, right? So how do we know where I might be failing in some degree as well?
From an IT perspective?
Yeah, from an IT organization perspective.
Like success criteria, like to know that we're actually succeeding?
Yeah, I think, that or like hitting a certain milestone, or I'm adding to that, like something that I guess could be like a success criteria, right? Like maybe also would be a bad milestone or a signal that it's not going well.
Okay, so I think it's maybe a maturity thing. So I mean, in our kind of companies in Bay Area, high-tech companies, usually the IT function really starts around, handing out laptops, making sure the Wi-Fi is working, and setting up a service desk to make everybody else in the company productive. The applications are scattered in a lot of the functional teams. I think one of the things that drives people to that next level of maturity is to prepare for an IPO, or this understanding that you want your systems of record managed in a somewhat more centralized way. Sometimes people do that because they get frustrated about all the data discrepancies, like they get reporting out of all these one-off SaaS apps, and they're not properly integrated, et cetera. So you go from that first maybe stage 1 maturity. I think I'm answering your question, which is really devoted to hardware and user services, to some degree of application support and management. And then, the next step of the process is typically to put in place some kind of a project management office. So IT can help orchestrate some larger initiatives within the company. And maybe that exists within a BizOps team or whatever, but I've seen IT teams then start to build out from the infrastructure and the app support into areas like vendor management for SaaS applications, like a PMO, like a data warehousing team, or a security, a small security group. And I'm not, in my mind, it's not deterministic, but again, you get from the bread and butter, infrastructure apps, and start to take responsibility for some of these other activities in the company. So that's, I think I've answered I think you were looking for like a maturity kind of model of the way these groups typically evolve.
Yeah, thanks. That helps.
All right. Well, as expected, there's more questions than time allows for, but we're going to have to save those for another time. Mark, it was awesome to have you here. Thank you so much. I think that, again, if the goal of the book was to sort of provoke thought, lay a blueprint, get everyone thinking about what the next decade looks like, I think the mission there has been accomplished, at least in this team. So really appreciate you spending the time with us. And I cannot wait to follow up with other questions with you on a personal level. And if everyone could just give a big virtual round of applause for Mark for coming and joining us today. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to point out to everybody that, you know, the book makes a great Christmas gift for that hard to buy for technology person that you know. So
yeah.
So keep it in mind as we, there's only 100 days left or whatever it is until Christmas. So.
Beautiful. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.